My childhood home was definitely haunted. I even have a drawing that might have been made by a ghost. I can, or could, feel it when there's a presence somewhere. There's a palpable sense of being watched, a tension and paranoia in the air that lingers and can simmer into full-blown terror. It makes you feel very vulnerable. When I was a younger child, I remember seeing glowing red eyes hanging in the air in my dark living room. I thought our house had werewolves or vampires. There was a phase in 3rd grade when glowing orbs would hang out in my room for several minutes at a time. I thought they were aliens. My child's mind was trying to make sense of things, but I definitely had a fear of the dark, specifically in our house. Most places were fine in the dark, but in our house, I always felt like I was being watched by something with malicious or, at best, neutral intentions. Paranormal things ramped up for me in high school, but to stay chronological, I had a cousin stay at our house one summer while most of us were on vacation between my 7th and 8th grades. My cousin Billy was helping my dad with various projects. One night, my cousin was going to bed in one bedroom, later dubbed the spooky room. Outside in the dark, he saw a figure leave our garage and enter our house. "Billy, help me!" My cousin heard my father shouting. Billy rushed to check on my father. My father had been sleeping and was irritated by Billy's presence. Billy went back to bed, only to hear it again. "Billy, help!" Again, cousin Billy rushed to check on my father, who was fine and confused by Billy's urgency. Billy slept on the couch that night. I didn't learn about this until years later. A couple of years later, my brother moved away to college, and I moved into his old bedroom, the spooky room. It was my freshman year of high school. I was always particularly creeped out by this room, but new changes are often intimidating. One morning, I woke up to see a skull perfectly drawn in the dust on the window across from where I slept. This was on the layer of dust facing the inside of the room, not the outside. No one had access to the room except me and my parents, who were not pranksters by any means. I showed my mom and wiped it away. A couple of weeks later, I was studying in that bedroom. It was night, and the lights were on, so the windows turned into mirrors. I looked up from my bed towards that skull window, and I saw in the reflection a white silhouette standing behind me. I held my gaze for maybe 10 seconds, just trying to grasp what I was looking at. I eventually turned my head around and saw nothing. I looked back at the window and saw nothing in the reflection. I slept on the couch for the next few nights. A couple more weeks later, I was lying in bed, listening to a late-night radio show. The lights were off. Looking through that same skull window, I saw a similar white silhouette outside striding past my window. I slept on the couch for several more nights. Over the course of weeks, I saw more things drawn in the dust of the windows. Generally, they were scribbles and shapes. I was scared they might be some sort of curse or something, so I wiped them away. Out of curiosity, I put a sticky note on the window that said, "Please write below." Several days later, a perfect circle appeared around the note, as if someone had put the base of a spray paint up against the surface. This wasn't like the finger drawings I'd seen earlier, but one drawing did really stand out. I decided to recreate it in MS Paint before I wiped it away. Over the years, I've shared this with friends and colleagues, and they mostly come to the same conclusion as I did before I tell them my interpretation. But yeah, for the majority of high school, I slept with the light on. I avoided that side of the house like the plague. Little things happened here and there, but nothing huge. Until it was senior year of high school. I was in the living room with my mother watching TV, and the clothes dryer finished. This dryer was directly down the hallway from the spooky room. I sucked it up and headed over to empty the machine, getting my usual feeling of immense dread and paranoia as I entered that side of the house. I bent over and started unloading the laundry, and my mind went blank. I lost control over my motor functions. My arms went limp, and beyond my control, my body stood up. I heard a masculine voice take a deep breath and hiss in my ear. I immediately regained control of my body and got out of there as fast as I could. Around that time period, my aunt came to stay with us for a month or two. She had no idea what I'd experienced there, but literally on her first day, the bathroom door slammed hard on her, and she immediately had us smudge the house to ward off whatever was there. I've experienced other paranormal things elsewhere, and I've had a couple of weird experiences where I think my dead relative warned me about a couple of imminent deaths in the family. But this post is already long, and I don't know who will see this. When I was little, I had a loft bed with a desk underneath. I've always been a pretty heavy sleeper. I could fall asleep at a concert, so it was strange when I began waking up at 3 a.m. every morning. Even stranger were the noises coming from the attic. Shuffling, knocking, boxes moving. My 9-year-old brain rationalized it as an animal or bird that had gotten in. After a few weeks of terrible sleep, I decided to knock back on my ceiling in the shave and a haircut pattern because I was bored and curious. I waited in silence for a few minutes until I was about to fall back asleep, and then I heard it. From the ceiling, just a foot above my face, it knocked back the pattern. Every night when I woke up, I'd knock and sometimes get a response. It gradually stopped over the years, but I still wake up at 3 a.m. every night. It's weird, but it only happens in my room. I sleep fine in hotels and other houses. 13 years later, I've started getting strange vibes around my house. I feel like I'm being watched. I sometimes hear someone saying my name, most notably before bed. Whatever says it is very close to my ear. I can feel their breath as they whisper. It freaks me out so much that it takes hours to get back to sleep. The shuffling in the attic has started up again, but I don't want to knock back anymore. There's a lot of weird stuff that happens. Things get moved. My dogs and cats stare at the same blank spot. These are just the things that are currently happening. I just don't know what to do anymore. My friend Carl's last apartment had 2 ghosts. One was a little girl who would play with your hair while you were hanging out in the living room and run along the vertical blinds, making them swing back and forth. The second ghost I never saw or heard, but I did feel him. One night, I locked myself out of my apartment. We lived in the same complex, one building over from each other. So I asked to crash at Carl's place for the night while he went to work, but he had told me not to go into his room. There was a male ghost who would tell you that you didn't belong there. His previous roommate had let several friends crash in his room, and a tall black shadow opened the door and said, "Get out," to all of them. It freaked them out. So here I am on the couch in the living room, my head on the end of the couch that looks down the hall to the bedrooms and bathroom. I swear I was being watched. Then it hit me, I needed to pee. And the bathroom was right across the hall from Carl's bedroom. Fantastic. So I slowly crept down the hall, and about 5 feet from my goal, I said, "Hey man, I just need to use the bathroom." Then it felt like a cloud of energy got pulled back into the bedroom, despite the door being closed. I did my thing and hauled ass back to the couch, but I put my head on the other end of the couch. Nothing outstanding happened, but it was just a really creepy vibe. On the positive side, at least Carl had someone looking out for him. I used to live in a basement apartment when I was in grad school. The landlady lived in the main house, and while she herself was super nice and cool, her house always felt really off to me. However, she charged a reasonable amount of rent, and I was only 2 miles from school. About a week or 2 after I moved in, I had gone to bed, and the apartment was pitch black at night. If my landlady ever wanted to speak to me, I would hear the doors above the stairs unlock, and she would call out to me. One night, I heard movement on the steps, but I didn't hear her unlock the doors, and it was probably 2 in the morning. She certainly didn't call out, saying she needed to talk to me. I heard these heavy steps descending the stairs, but I was so scared that I shrank further into my bed to hide. The floor began to creak towards my door, and then nothing for a few seconds. I wasn't sure if it was safe to relax and go back to bed. Then I heard the doorknob start to turn. My fear made me so scared that I pulled the covers over my head to hide. I prayed the whole time under the covers. The next thing I knew, it was finally morning. I stayed in that apartment for 2 years. When it was my graduation, I slept in a hotel because there was no room for my family to sleep. That night in the hotel was the first restful sleep I had in what felt like forever. Apart from specters appearing at random intervals, the most chilling experience was the night before Christmas. For background, the spirit in our home had proved to be very possessive of me, constantly attempting to keep me from my boyfriend and win my attention, perhaps even my affection. Every night when he would be working into the wee hours, I fell asleep in our room with the bedroom door unlocked to grant him easy access. Every night when he got home, it was firmly locked. I heard him calling for me in other rooms while I was showering, only to emerge and find the house empty and my boyfriend either at the gas station or in the backyard. The spirit would sit next to me on the bed, appear to me while I was bathing, and rap on the wall when I was alone. It was always after my attention. My then boyfriend was deployed, and I was just starting on a glass of wine, settling onto the living room couch. We had decorated right before he left, but I was lonely and hadn't heard from him in a day or two. A few tears slipped, and I heard a sound. No branch had moved, there was no breeze or fan, but a glass ball had gently dropped from the tree onto the wood floor without breaking. I stared at it as it stayed in place for a second under the tree. Then it slowly rolled 4 feet in my direction, over the lip of the thick, heavy rug, which shouldn't have been possible, and stopped directly in front of my feet. This was the first of many gifts to cheer me up. Shortly after, I received a vintage children's card, a queen of spades with torn edges and yellowed paper. I don't know where it came from. It appeared one day, and when I would throw it out, it would appear somewhere else. The garage, the windowsill, under the bed. One time, my boyfriend threw it out, as if in angry retaliation. When I was in the bath that evening, the spirit of a woman sat on my chest, pressing me into the water. I couldn't move. It was like a night terror, but with the risk of drowning. She had such a twisted, hateful face. After a moment of clawing at the sides of the tub, I was released. We sold the house earlier this year and moved across the country. We found out that the previous owner had been a depressed, manic hoarder who seemingly abused animals in the home. I don't know what happened to her, if she died in the house or not, but the spirit that dwelled there was the unhappiest thing I'd ever encountered. I almost feel sorry for it. Growing up, I used to live in a fairly large 2-story house. I'm pretty sure it was built in the early 1900s because when we moved in during the mid-90s, my dad told me it was already 100 years old. It was a really cool house with a huge backyard, but there were some really creepy parts. The basement, of course, was dark and unfinished, with 2 small rooms facing each other. One of the rooms was especially creepy. It had these weird dividers on the floor made of plywood, kind of like stalls in a horse stable, but on a much smaller scale. On the landing heading to the 2nd floor was a big door about halfway up the wall that led to an attic space. The door wasn't attached in any way. It was just leaned up against the jamb. This attic was particularly spooky because the walls were covered in newspaper clippings of people with their eyes scratched out. Sounds like a cliché horror movie, but seeing it in real life was chilling. There were always a lot of weird noises in that house. It was old, so it's to be expected. We would hear creaks and knocks, sometimes the occasional bang, but we rarely saw anything really strange. It didn't seem like a haunted house at all. That is, until one day my younger brother and my cousin were playing with a webcam, making a video on Windows Movie Maker. In the video, my brother starts adjusting the camera, and as soon as he moves his hand away, you can very clearly see something moving behind them. Quickly ducks behind them and disappears. My brother didn't notice, but my cousin did. He quickly turned around to check but didn't see anything. We watched that video over and over, and I eventually noticed that you can see whatever it is actually materialize while my brother is moving the camera around. Whatever it was, it looked kind of like the head of a bat, but about the size of a fist. I've seen and heard a lot of weird things aside from that, but that was the only real experience from that creepy-ass house. I spent my childhood until I was 9 in McLean, Virginia, a suburb of Washington, D.C. I lived there with my parents and 3 older siblings, who had all moved out by the time I was around 6. The house was a single level with a large finished basement. I had various paranormal experiences as a child, the most common being a woman's voice randomly saying my name, even when my parents were outside and I was alone in the house. It was never threatening, just a normal voice calmly saying my name, though of course it scared the hell out of me. The other experience was really creepy. Sometimes, if I woke up in the middle of the night, a scene would play on my bedroom wall, always the same scene. An old-fashioned horse and buggy pulling up, and a woman getting out. It was faded and jittery, like it was being played on an old projector with a sort of strobe effect. Then it would just stop and the room would go dark again. The last experience I had was the scariest and thankfully the last. It was the week my family was getting ready to move. My aunt and uncle had come down to help, and I was playing hide and seek with my cousins. I hid in a downstairs closet. The last thing I remember is a sensation of hands around my neck, strangling me. The next thing I remember is my cousins standing over me, screaming for help. My parents rushed me to the emergency room. They checked me over and could find nothing wrong. The doctor concluded I had suffered an asthma attack, though I had no history of asthma before or after that one event. We moved into a newly built house, absolutely the most unhaunted house in existence, and over the years, I chalked my experiences up to an overactive childhood imagination. Fast forward 10 years. I'm now a freshman in college, and my siblings and I are all together for Thanksgiving. Conversation turns to the old house in McLean, and my sister says, "I never was so happy as the day I got married and moved out of that haunted hellhole." This is the first time I'd ever heard any of my family say they had similar experiences, so we began comparing notes. My sister told us about seeing a woman in a white dress on several occasions. In one instance, she was laying in bed on the phone when she saw a woman walk into her bedroom, stand by the mirror, fidget like she was putting on an earring, then just walk out. My sister assumed it was our mom, though mom was always the blue jeans type, so my sister was curious why she was dressing up. She hung up the phone, walked into the kitchen, and found mom standing at the sink in her blue jeans, doing dishes. She asked mom if she had been in her room, and mom said, "No, I've been doing dishes for the last half hour." My brothers seemed embarrassed and wouldn't go into detail about what they saw. They just kind of blew it off, saying, "We saw some strange things, but we were smoking a lot of dope at the time, so who knows what was real and what wasn't." Likewise, my mom said we were pretty much all crazy, as she had spent more time in the house than anyone and never saw anything whatsoever. Though my sister told me later that wasn't entirely true, as mom had once told her about seeing the woman in white. My sister said mom was just so determined that none of them talked about it around me when I was young that she had convinced herself it never happened. My dad had perhaps the most bizarre story. He was an electrician and had a workshop in the basement. One day he was working with his soldering iron, set it down on the workbench, turned around to pick up a tool, and when he turned back around, it was simply gone. He worried that a hot soldering iron had fallen somewhere it might start a fire, so he searched all over for it, but it was nowhere to be found. At first, he thought one of my brothers was playing a prank, but he realized they couldn't have gotten into the workshop without him seeing. Eventually, he just threw his hands up in disbelief and bought another one. Fast forward several months to Christmas time. The Christmas tree and all the decorations were kept in a closet next to the workshop. During the year, there were boxes piled around the door, so it wasn't even accessible. Dad opened the door, turned on the light, and there lay his soldering iron, right on top of the very first box, the cord tightly wound around it and looking like it had been gently placed there. Curiously, this was the exact same closet I had the strangling incident in. Then my dad told a really scary story. After he and my mom got married and bought the house, and before any of us kids came along, his niece was trying to get a job in DC, so she asked if she could move in until she found a job. He fixed up a bedroom in the basement so she could have some privacy. The first night, he and my mom were awakened by a loud scream. Dad grabbed his gun from the nightstand and rushed downstairs, thinking there must be an intruder. His niece was sitting on the edge of the bed, her face pale, a look of terror on her face. He tried to get her to say what happened, but she would just shake her head and refuse to talk about it. She absolutely would not go back in the basement and wouldn't even get near the basement door when it was open. She slept upstairs on the couch for 2 days until she could make arrangements to go back home. She wouldn't even go back in the basement to get her belongings. Dad had to pack them up for her. He never had much contact with her after that, but eventually asked her mother if she ever said what she saw. Her mother claimed that she had seen someone come into the room. She thought it was just my dad coming back after having forgotten to tell her something. But when she sat up to talk, the figure of a man was grinning at her with a swollen, blackened face, eyes swollen shut, covered in blood, and grinning teeth protruding from shriveled purple lips. After hearing all this, my sister got curious and did some research. The house was part of a group of houses built by a housing developer in the mid-1920s. At that time, most people lived near where they worked, but he got the idea to build a housing development for upper-income federal workers who would like to live in a more rural setting and commute to work. This idea was about 25 years ahead of its time, as suburbs really didn't exist in the 1920s. He worked out a deal with a contractor. If he built the houses, he could have one of his choice as payment. Unfortunately, when the stock market collapsed, the country went into a depression. Both the developer and the contractor lost everything. The contractor ended up hanging himself in the house he had picked for his own, which, you guessed it, was ours. The house sat empty for several years and was then bought by a couple with no children. The husband died shortly thereafter, but the wife lived there for the rest of her life until she passed away and my parents purchased it. Reading between the lines, I think the bad spirit in the basement that my dad's niece saw and that tried to choke me was the ghost of the contractor who had killed himself in the house. I think the lady in white was harmless, maybe even protective, probably the old lady who had lived there before my parents. I also think she was the one who whispered my name. As for the horse and buggy, I don't think that was really even related to the house, just some scene from long before the house was built that replayed over and over. The house was torn down in 2009, and now a swanky-looking million-dollar home sits in its place. Not sure if the spirits have now found rest, but I have noticed the house has already been resold 3 times since 2012 when it was built, so people don't seem to be staying long. When I was a child, the house on the corner caught fire. My brother's friend, who was maybe 9 years old, passed away due to smoke inhalation. A couple of years later, the house was being lived in by another family. My friends and I were screwing around in front of my house when we noticed the drapes start to move in the house. We waved and thought nothing of it. The next morning, the family pulled in and started to unpack. I asked, "Who were you watching at the house last night?" The homeowner came over, and I explained what my buddies and I had observed. He stopped, and I saw the hair standing up on his head. He stated that no one was watching the house. That's when I told him about the moving drapes on the second floor. A week later, his son was riding his bike around the block. So I asked him if stuff moves around a lot in the house. The kid didn't say anything. I then asked if there was a ball that always ended up on the stairs on the second floor. Note: my brother's friend used to leave a ball on the stairwell, just a bad habit he had. That's when the homeowner's son raised an eyebrow and asked how I knew. I told him to ask, insert the deceased friend's name here, to stop and pick his ball up. At 11 p.m., the kid burst through the door yelling and screaming that it moved. It moved. I looked up to the window and saw the curtain move again, really slow. 1 week later, the house was back on the market. The childhood home I grew up in was definitely haunted, and it still gives me goosebumps thinking about it. Our whole family would be downstairs watching TV, eating dinner, or just sitting around, and everyone would hear very clear footsteps on the second floor pacing back and forth. My parents used to tell my sister and me that because the pipes were connected between homes, we could hear the footsteps of neighbors. It didn't really make sense. But sure, when I was buying my first house, I casually mentioned to my mom that I hoped I wouldn't be able to hear the neighbors walking in their homes. That was when she remembered that it was a lie they'd tell my sister and me so that we wouldn't be scared. My sister and I had lots of nightmares growing up, and my mom didn't think it'd be a good idea to tell us that she was also scared or that ghosts exist. My mom said from the way the footsteps sounded, it seemed as if when my grandma, Dad's mom, was alive, she would pace upstairs to get me to fall asleep. My dad always found comfort in hearing those footsteps pacing back and forth after his mom passed. So I guess that's why no one made a big deal out of it. My childhood home was definitely haunted. I mean, every single person who spent any significant amount of time in the house knew it and experienced something, to include family friends. My brother and I both had our beds pushed, as if someone stood at the foot of our beds and shoved them into the walls. We both audibly heard footsteps running away each time, like whatever or whoever was playing a game with us. My brother, my brother's best friend, my mother, and I all saw apparitions of a very tall figure wandering around. Sometimes in the room as we woke up, sometimes in broad daylight. A picture of my brother and I as kids would continuously shift in its place on an armoire we had in the house. My mother is a stickler for how she had the house organized. All of the pictures were arranged slanted so that they could be seen from the primary sitting area of the room. The picture of my brother and I would always move facing straight forward. It ramped up after I left for college, and my brother would leave his room and come back to his drawers open, things on the floor, etc. My bro would also hear things in my room and think I was home because I only went to school an hour away and would visit fairly often. I remember getting the text, "Why the hell are you home?" as I was sitting in class an hour away. My dad was always a big doubter of it all because for some reason it never really messed with him. But one night while my mom, brother, and I were all gone, the shutters downstairs started slamming. Thinking someone was trying to break in, but not in the house because the alarm hadn't gone off, he grabbed his gun and went downstairs. When he got there, a couple of their plantation shutters were swung open. He closed them and went upstairs confused, only to find that the shutters next to their bed had been opened while he was downstairs. He's a believer now. My brother and I also hated our guest bedroom. Not only did we see things out of the corner of our eyes there, but there was a feeling of unease that came with even getting close to it. My mother never felt it, but my brother and I avoided it even into adulthood. Eventually, the house was sold to a Chinese immigrant couple, and none of us have been back or experienced anything like that in our future homes. We all still talk about how insane that house and neighborhood was and speculate about what it was. Now that I'm thinking of it, the city, Temecula, was famous for having once all been native land, and there were a number of burial sites found around the city as it was developing. One of these was behind our neighborhood. While we lived there, 5 of our neighbors got cancer. Strange.